It is the 9th of February 1943, and a cold rain is falling on the Rue Sainte-Catherine in Lyon. A young man climbs the stairs to the third floor of a building belonging to the General Union of Jewish Students. He is carrying textbooks. He does not know that the staircase below him is filling with men in plain coats, men who have been watching this address for weeks. Within minutes, 86 students and staff will be marched out into the street and driven away in requisitioned lorries. Almost none of them will return. The man giving the orders that morning is 29 years old. A lieutenant with a boyish face and a taste for cruelty that will earn him a name whispered across the city for decades afterwards: the Butcher of Lyon. His office, the place where these operations are planned and where their human cost is inflicted in private, is not a fortress or a barracks. It is a school. Specifically, it is a grand 19th century building on the Avenue Berthelot that had, until recently, trained French army doctors to save lives. Within a matter of months, it will become one of the most feared addresses in occupied France, a place where interrogation and torture happen behind windows that once looked out onto lecture halls and dissection rooms. Elsewhere in the city, that same morning, informants are already reporting back to their handlers, and lorries queue quietly on side streets waiting for the signal to move. None of the 86 people arrested that day have any warning. They believe, right up until the moment plain-coated men appear on the staircase, that they are simply attending to the ordinary business of a student union. This is the world Klaus Barbie has built around himself in a matter of weeks. An invisible web of watchers, informants, and waiting vehicles, all of it coordinated from behind the walls of a building that any passerby on the Avenue Berthelot would still have recognized, from the outside, as a school. This is the story of how a medical school became the headquarters of the Gestapo in Lyon, and of the man who turned its corridors into a machine for extracting confessions through pain. It matters because it shows, with brutal clarity, how easily the ordinary architecture of civic life, a school built to heal, can be requisitioned and repurposed into an instrument of terror, and how the physical memory of that transformation still stands today for anyone who cares to visit. To understand why this building became so significant, you have to understand the peculiar position Lyon occupied in wartime France. Until November 1942, Lyon sat inside the so-called Free Zone, the southern portion of the country nominally governed by the collaborationist Vichy regime rather than administered directly by Germany. That status, however illusory in practice, gave the city something precious: relative freedom of movement, a functioning postal and rail network, and a population large enough to hide activity within its everyday rhythms. It is little wonder that Lyon became, in the words later used by historians, something close to the capital of the French resistance. Clandestine newspapers were printed in its back rooms. Escape lines for downed Allied airmen and Jewish refugees fleeing north passed through its streets. Coded messages moved along its rail lines towards Switzerland and the Mediterranean coast. For the resistance networks operating there, Lyon's anonymity was armor in itself. That armor cracked in November 1942, when German forces crossed the demarcation line and occupied the whole of France, following the Allied landings in North Africa. Overnight, Lyon lost the buffer that had allowed resistance activity to flourish with comparative ease. Berlin's security apparatus moved quickly to fill the vacuum. The Reich Main Security Office dispatched 6 mobile task forces into the newly occupied south, establishing regional Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst branches in Lyon, Limoges, Marseille, Montpellier, Toulouse, and Vichy. Each branch was tasked with 2 overlapping missions: the destruction of resistance networks and the identification, arrest, and deportation of Jewish residents. Lyon, given its size and its reputation as a hive of clandestine activity, was treated as a priority posting, and the officer sent to run it was a Cologne-born SS lieutenant named Klaus Barbie. The scale of the problem facing men like Barbie was, on paper, enormous. Lyon's resistance networks were fragmented deliberately into small, compartmentalized cells, precisely so that the arrest of one member could not unravel the whole. Intelligence had to be extracted person by person, often through a single captured courier or radio operator, and every day of delay gave the resistance time to warn its members and disappear. Existing German policing methods, built for peacetime criminal investigation, were not designed for this kind of pursuit. What was needed was a fixed, centralized base of operations, somewhere with the space to hold interrogation rooms, filing systems, a radio interception unit, cell space for detainees awaiting transfer, and offices for dozens of officers coordinating raids across the wider region. It needed to be large, defensible, centrally located, and already built. Requisitioning solved the problem in the most efficient way available to an occupying power. Rather than construct anything new, simply seize a building that already had everything required. There was also a manpower problem that has often been overlooked in accounts of this period. Barbie's Lion Gestapo section was never a particularly large organization in absolute terms, numbering at most a few hundred German officers and locally recruited auxiliaries responsible for policing a metropolitan region of hundreds of thousands of people. A force that small could not hope to identify and dismantle resistance networks through conventional surveillance alone. It had to rely on informants, on the interception of coded communications, and above all, on rapid, brutal interrogation of anyone captured in the hope that names and addresses could be extracted before word spread and the network reorganized itself. This created a grim operational logic. The faster and more completely a prisoner could be broken, the more effective the whole apparatus became. That logic demanded a physical space purpose-built for exactly this kind of processing, somewhere prisoners could be moved quickly from holding cells to interrogation rooms and back again, out of public view, with enough separate chambers that multiple interrogations could run in parallel. An ordinary police station or requisitioned hotel simply could not offer that kind of throughput. A former medical school, designed from the outset to move large numbers of people efficiently between wards, lecture theaters, and storage areas, could. The building chosen was the École du Service de Santé Militaire, the French Army's school for training military doctors and pharmacists, standing on the Avenue Berthelot in Lyon's 7th arrondissement. It had been designed in the closing years of the 19th century by the city's chief architect, Abraham Hirsch, and completed in 1894 to replace an older military medical school lost to France after the Franco-Prussian War. 3 substantial pavilions were arranged around a broad, tree-lined inner courtyard built for a very different purpose: to give young medical cadets, nicknamed the Santards, room to study anatomy, pharmacology, and the practicalities of battlefield medicine. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the school had already survived one round of upheaval. Converted briefly into an army hospital during the previous conflict, its graduates decorated repeatedly for service in the trenches. In the early years of the German occupation, it continued to function in a diminished way, sharing its premises with displaced students from the École Polytechnique. Its long, echoing corridors and generous cellar space, features intended to move stretcher cases and store medical supplies, were about to be repurposed for an entirely different kind of human traffic. In March and April of 1943, 5 of the 6 administrative sections of the German security police moved their offices into the school's buildings, taking over the pavilions almost wholesale. Section 4, the Gestapo proper, was placed under Barbie's direct command, and it is here that the building's transformation becomes genuinely chilling in its detail. The 3 pavilions that Abraham Hirsch had arranged around a single tree-lined courtyard, originally designed so that staff could move easily between lecture rooms, dormitories, and the small hospital wing, now gave the occupying force exactly the kind of compartmentalized layout and intelligence organization required. One pavilion could house administrative staff and filing rooms without ever needing contact with the section running interrogations in another. Officers coordinating raids across the wider Rhône-Alpes region could work from upstairs offices while, in the same complex, prisoners were being processed through entirely separate stairwells below. The cellars beneath the Larry Pavilion, spaces originally intended for storing medical equipment, were converted into holding cells, their thick stone walls and lack of windows making them ideally suited, in the coldest sense of that word, to confining prisoners awaiting interrogation. Picture a school storeroom, the kind built to keep instruments cool and dry and quiet, repurposed instead to keep human beings out of sight and out of earshot. Upstairs, former lecture rooms and administrative offices, spaces that had once held rows of desks and anatomical charts, became interrogation chambers. Detainees held at the nearby Montluc prison. The building's sheer scale is worth dwelling on because it explains a great deal about why it was chosen over smaller, more discreet alternatives. This was not a townhouse or a requisitioned hotel suite. It was an institutional complex large enough to have trained successive generations of army doctors and pharmacists, with room enough, once repurposed, to accommodate 5 separate administrative sections of the German security police simultaneously, each with its own staff, its own filing systems, and its own chain of command, all operating under one roof within sight of the same central courtyard. Among the building's most notorious prisoners was Jean Moulin, the resistance leader who had been sent by General de Gaulle to unify France's fractured resistance movements under a single command. Moulin was arrested in June 1943 near Lyon and brought to the Avenue Berthelot, where he was interrogated over a period of roughly 8 days. He never revealed the information Barbie wanted. He died from the injuries inflicted during that questioning, and his death turned him into one of the enduring symbols of French resistance to Nazi occupation, a status confirmed decades later when his remains were transferred to the Pantheon in Paris. Records of the interrogation itself remain frustratingly sparse, pieced together largely from post-war testimony and the later trial proceedings against Barbie himself, and historians continue to debate precise details of what happened inside those rooms even now. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth pausing here to compare Lyon's Gestapo headquarters with equivalent Nazi security installations elsewhere in occupied Europe, because the pattern of seizing civic buildings for this purpose was not unique to France. In Paris, the Gestapo's most feared address was 84 Avenue Foch, an elegant townhouse rather than an institutional building, chosen for its discretion in a fashionable residential district close to the Bois de Boulogne. It offered secrecy rather than scale, a handful of rooms in which counterintelligence officers worked on captured Allied agents, quite unlike the sprawling, multi-section apparatus that grew up around Barbie and Lyon. In the Netherlands, German security services took over school buildings, office blocks, and even a former orphanage in cities such as Amsterdam and The Hague for similar administrative purposes, though few achieved the scale of the Lyon complex, which could house 5 entire administrative sections under one roof. In Poland, occupying authorities frequently seized school buildings not for security operations, but to convert them into administrative centers for German settlers, a related but distinct pattern of requisition driven more by demographic policy than by counterintelligence needs. Compared with these Allied and occupied territory equivalents, the École du Service de Santé Militaire was unusually large and unusually well suited to its new function, precisely because it had been engineered from the outset to move large numbers of people efficiently through wards, corridors, and storage spaces. Where a requisitioned townhouse might hold a handful of officers and 1 or 2 detainees at a time, the Lyon School could sustain an entire regional apparatus of surveillance, filing, interrogation, and detention simultaneously, which goes some way towards explaining why the city's resistance network suffered such catastrophic losses under Barbie's command between 1943 and 1944. Historians studying the broader pattern of Gestapo requisitions across France have noted that the choice of building often mattered less than the ruthlessness of the officer placed in charge of it. And in Lyon, those 2 factors, an unusually capacious headquarters and an unusually vicious commanding officer, combined to devastating effect. The building's period as Gestapo headquarters came to an abrupt physical end on May 26, 1944, when an Allied bombing raid aimed at Lyon's rail infrastructure struck the surrounding district of Jean Massé and badly damaged the school's facade along the Avenue Berthelot. Barbie's operations continued from the site in reduced form until the liberation of Lyon that August, by which point his forces had already carried out further atrocities elsewhere in the region, including massacres of prisoners taken from Montluc as Allied troops approached the city. Barbie himself escaped capture at the time, was later recruited by American intelligence for a period after the war, and eventually fled to South America, where he lived under a false identity for more than 3 decades before being extradited to France in 1983. His trial in 1987, the first prosecution for crimes against humanity ever held in a French court, brought the building's history back into public consciousness, and it was in the aftermath of that trial that the decision was taken to turn the site into a permanent museum. The legacy of what happened inside that building is difficult to measure in purely material terms. The intelligence extracted through torture undoubtedly damaged specific resistance networks in and around Lyon. But historians remain cautious about attributing precise operational losses to information gained under interrogation there, since much of what the Gestapo learned came equally from informants, intercepted communications, and simple police work elsewhere in the city. What is measurable, and what endures most powerfully, is the psychological and symbolic weight the building has carried ever since. Its transformation from a place dedicated to training doctors, to a place associated with the systematic infliction of suffering, and back again into a place of public memory, gives it a kind of layered significance that few wartime sites possess. When the war ended, the city of Lyon faced an unusual dilemma. What does one do with a building that has served 2 such radically opposed purposes within the space of a single decade? The answer, in the end, was neither to demolish it nor to pretend its darkest years had not happened, but to rebuild it and let it stand as testimony. Architects Victor Clermont and Étienne de Chavannes were given responsibility for the reconstruction, and the worst damaged section of the facade facing Avenue Berthelot, shattered by the 1944 bombing raid, was replaced with a plain stone portico rather than restored to its original 19th century appearance, a small but telling decision that left a visible seam in the building's history. Restoration work continued for years, only concluding in 1962, and the medical school itself did not fully leave the site until 1981, when it relocated to new premises at Braun, on the outskirts of the city. Since 1992, the eastern wing of the complex has housed the Centre d'Histoire de la Résistance et de la Déportation, a museum dedicated not to Barbie himself, but to the resistance he tried to destroy and the victims he tortured and deported, including detailed exhibits on the Rue Sainte-Catherine raid and the wartime history of the school buildings themselves. Visitors today can walk through spaces that once served as Gestapo offices while reading the testimony of the very people who were held and questioned there, a juxtaposition the museum's curators have clearly chosen deliberately rather than by accident. Fragments of shrapnel from the 1944 bombing, gathered by a local resident from the surrounding streets and later donated to the collection, sit alongside photographs, uniforms, and recorded interviews, forming a physical bridge between the building's wartime ordeal and the historical record now preserved within its walls. Return, for a moment, to that wet February morning on the Rue Sainte-Catherine, to the young man climbing the stairs with his textbooks. He could not have known that the offices coordinating his arrest sat inside a building constructed to teach men how to save lives, nor that decades later visitors would walk those same corridors, reading the names of the students, doctors, and resistance fighters who passed through them under such different circumstances. A school became a torture chamber. A torture chamber became a museum. Nothing about the stone and plaster changed in any of this. Only the purpose imposed upon it by the people who occupied it did. That is, in the end, the quiet and unsettling lesson of the Avenue Berthelot. Buildings hold no morality of their own. They become what the people inside them choose to make of them, for better and, as Lyon learned between 1943 and 1944, for very much worse. The lecture halls that once echoed with anatomy lessons echoed instead with interrogation. The cellars built to store bandages and instruments became cells. And when the guns finally fell silent over Lyon in the autumn of 1944, what was left standing on the Avenue Berthelot was not simply a damaged building, but a warning, carved in scorched stone and shattered glass, about how swiftly the instruments of care can be turned into instruments of cruelty, and how carefully a society must guard against ever allowing that to happen again.